Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this diocesan webinar on handling COVID-related trauma as individuals and communities. I'm especially pleased to welcome Hilary Ison and Carla Grosch-Miller as our guest speakers today. Following the format of a previous webinar, we'll listen to each speaker and then break into digital rooms to discuss the issues and then allow space towards the end for questions to be put to our speakers. But please bear in mind that you can ask these questions from this point using the chat facility at the bottom of your screen. There is surface uniformity in the virus's impact. We've all been at risk from contracting it and all locked down in our private, if not necessarily our public lives. It's hard to think of an event having a similar effect in our lifetimes, and it's been replicated across the world. But its impacts have varied greatly, from the fairly mild to the absolutely horrific. In the UK, tens of thousands have died, hundreds of thousands have been bereaved. Some have lived their lives near the virus, always at risk. Others have had to live without human company for months, or in homes where relationships have broken down, or violence and abuse have escalated. And yet, despite that, we're only at the start of its impact on the economy, on jobs and livelihoods, and especially on mental health. Trauma isn't linear. People are rarely in the same place at the same time emotionally, and some are more deeply affected because it triggers other memories. There's no mountain bike to take us rapidly through the valley of the shadow of death. It's a painstaking walk we make at different speeds. We are promised that God is close to the brokenhearted, and in our ministry we want to embody that pledge. But to do it with empathy and intuition, we need to understand ourselves better and what's going on around us, which is why we're here today. Our first speaker this morning is the Reverend Hilary Ison. Hilary has been in authorised ministry in the Anglican Church since 1980. She's been a parish priest, hospital chaplain, advisor for women in ministry and member of a bishop's senior staff team, a theological educator, and latterly a member of the team of selection secretaries overseeing the national selection panels for those offering for ordained ministry in the Church of England. As a theological educator, Hilary taught practical and pastoral theology with a special focus on enabling learning through group reflection and on leading groups and teams as a minister. Having discovered through the experience of working in teams in various contexts, a real affinity for and interest in the dynamics operating in teams and organisations and the impact on individuals within them. Her recent training is in systems constellations, a method of exploring traumatic events and difficult personal and organisational issues in individuals or group settings. We're delighted to welcome Hilary this morning as our first speaker, and I'm going to hand over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. It's really good to be with you all. It sounds like a long list of things, but that's just accrued over a good number of years that I've been in ministry. So yeah, it's good to be with you. And myself and Carla, who will be speaking later, will be taking you through these sessions. Mine is on the impact of trauma on individuals, and then Carla will expand on that, on the impact in our congregations and collective trauma. So as we begin, because one of the things that we're really going to be learning about through these sessions is how trauma impacts the body, not just the mind, but the body, the unity of our whole selves. So we're going to start just by taking some time just to breathe and to be still, because no doubt, like me, you've all perhaps been rushing around this morning and have just arrived here in this Zoom room. So I'm going to invite us all just to take 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll speak a little bit through those minutes, and then we'll have some quiet, and then I'll draw it together at the end. But I'd just like you, as you're sitting in your seat, maybe to close your eyes, just to take a rest from Zoom, if like me, you're zoomed out, and to be present to yourself as you close your eyes or keep them open, whatever works best for you. And I invite you just to be still. And as you're sitting still, noticing your body sitting in the seat, notice your breathing. We take it for granted, but it is the breath of life, the breath that God breathed into us right at our beginning and at the beginning of the world. So as you breathe, just notice your breath and maybe slightly elongate it. The in-breath and the out-breath. The in-breath and the out-breath. And as you're sitting in stillness, maybe you will notice what your body is feeling at this time, where there's areas of tension in shoulders or chest or stomach or head or wherever, or perhaps you're feeling really well and rested, or a bit of both. But just be present without judgment or explanation, but with kindness to whatever you're experiencing. It may be impatience, it may be just glad to be still for a moment. And just notice. Thank you, Lord God, for our bodies, ourselves, for one another. Help us to be present to ourselves, to each other, and to you who are always present with us in our breath, the breath of life, and in your love that holds us in being. Amen. I'd just like to remind you of the health warning, as we call it, that was sent out in the information before this session, that even just sometimes thinking about trauma or talking about it, it can trigger, as Bishop Simon said, it can trigger things for us, because often our memories, as we'll find out as we go through these sessions, are held in our bodies. Our body can hold memory. Just as much as our heads, in fact more than our heads. So sometimes our bodies tell us what we may have been holding on to or holding at bay. So if your body starts to react, or you start to find some kind of thing going on that troubles you, then just take a moment just to do that breathing and to be present to where you are and look around and see what colour the curtains are. Whatever it is that helps you to settle in the moment, but notice that that may be something you need to come back to at another time in a safe place with your safe people. So just notice it, but take care of yourself through these sessions. We're not going to ask you to be sharing lots of deep personal stuff about your past traumas, although we will be talking about our experience in this lockdown period. So it's very much in your control as to what you want to share, but take care of yourself. And now I'm going to screen share now. So here we are. So as we come to our session, I just want to, particularly for our breakout groups, just to agree confidentiality, but throughout this whole session, to keep the time and space as safe as possible for learning. I'd like us to agree that, particularly in our groups, this will be a kind listening space without judgment, that we speak for ourselves, not on behalf of others, and that what is said in the breakout Zoom room stays there. And afterwards we share our own learning if we want to with whomever, but not the stories of others. That's really important. And as I've just said, we take responsibility for what we say. And we're not asking you to share anything that you're not comfortable with. So please do make sure that it's a safe space for you and that we can make it a safe space for others. So I'll take it that that's okay. There may be other things that you want to add, so do say in your breakout groups if there's anything else that is important for you that you would want to add. I guess a sense of humour is always helpful too. Okay, so as I've said earlier, one of the things that we're going to learn is very much that our bodies keep the score, and that's the title of a book by Bessel van der Kolk. It's quite a significant book that a lot of people have already read, and it's one of the foundational texts in the field of trauma research, which has been happening over this past 30 to 40 years. And we've been learning to recognise, as another author, Peter Levine, another neurobiologist, has spoken about, we have what we call the unspoken voice of the body. And therefore learning to tune into that is really important. By the way, these notes will be sent out as a handout afterwards. So obviously make your own notes, but we will send these out afterwards as well. And I'm going to start with something. This is how our bodies tell us things. I'm going to start with something called the vagal nerve. Now, some of you may be medics or psychiatrists or other people who are medical. I'm not. So I'm making this really simple. And the danger of making something simple is that it doesn't cover everything. But so how do we know what our bodies are telling us? We know because we have something called the vagal nerve, a big bundle of nerves, quite hefty bundle of nerves that runs all the way up from our gut, follows the spine, all the way up to our brain and our brainstem. It's a superhighway, if you like. And about 80% of the fibers in the vagal nerve run up from the gut to the brain. And only 20% runs down from the brain to the gut. So basically, all the information, 80% of the information that we have about how we are in the world and how we're doing and what's happening for us is coming from the gut upwards. We actually have brain tissue, enteric brain cells in our gut, which is amazing. And that's conveying information up to our brains. Often we think it's our brains that tell us everything. But 20% of the information that goes to how we know how we are in the world comes from the brain. It processes the information coming from the gut. So what your gut, your body is telling you about how you are is really important. And there's two main big nerves in that vagal nerve. There's the parasympathetic nervous system that regulates the body's relaxation mechanism. And that's when you breathe out. It's activating that parasympathetic nervous system. So to calm yourself and to rest and digest is the out breath. The in breath is that which energizes you, the sympathetic nervous system. And it deals with heart rate and blood pressure to respond to any stressful situation. So this bit about the vagal nerve is hugely important because we're not used to working with this, and you can actually practice improving the tone of your vagal nerve, just like you do with muscles. And you do that with your breath, the in-breath, and being positively aware and present to your breath. So that's a little bit of information that we will come back to as we go through this presentation. And so as we're looking at the impact of trauma on the brain, when I say brain, we're talking about the whole body brain, if you like, the whole tripartite brain, which we'll look at in a moment. And so trauma, the key things about trauma is it's not in the event itself. Bishop Simon was saying something like this at the beginning, but it's in the brain body of the person. It's a whole body response to trauma, not simply in the head. And trauma responses are entirely normal. We can't stop them from happening, and we'll see why in a moment. And it's the way our brains and our bodies are trying to look after us in order to save us and keep us alive. And that's why we respond to threatening or dangerous events in the way that we do, because our body and our brain does it for us. And not everyone is traumatized by the same event. And for those who are traumatized, they may not have the same kinds of trauma response. It very much depends on the individual. So that's just some key points just to make right at the beginning. And so what we're going to look at now is something called the tripartite brain, which is how our brains work. And there's something that we're going to use called the brain in the palm of the hand model by Dan Siegel. He sort of coined this little illustration that I'm going to use. And if you want to look it up when you get these notes, there's a link there to a little video YouTube clip. But what I'm going to do is use my hand. Can everybody see me in a box? I hope so. You might want to put speaker view on if you can. I don't know if you can with screen share. In fact, I could stop the screen share at this point. Okay, so here we have the brains, the vagal nerve and the spine coming up to the brain stem. So this is all that I was talking about the vagal nerve. It comes up to the first part of our brain, the oldest part of our brain, that is, some people call it the reptilian brain. It's the bit that, that does our breathing, our sleeping, our eating. It's simply to do with survival. So I'm here with my daughter at the moment, who's just had a newborn baby in Devon. And you can see this instinctual brain working, just has to keep it alive. And we have that part of our brains as well. And then in the middle of the palm here, with the little thumb tucked over, is our limbic system, the second part of the brain in terms of its evolution, the mammalian brain. So we have the reptilian one, the mammalian one here, which is to do with emotions, parenting, nurture, reproduction, and motivation. So this is all to do with our relating, our social brain, if you like, and the way we take care of ourselves and one another. And I'll come back to this amygdala in a minute, our early warning system, and I'll show you a picture of it as well. And then over the top of that, that comes right over, connecting it all up, is our thinking brain. The last bit of our brain to evolve that distinguishes us from animals, if you like, is our capacity to think, to reason, to have language, ideas, planning, imagination, and empathy, in the right and left hemisphere. So that's the cortex, the neocortex, that comes over the brain like that. So it's all connected up. And when it's working well together like that, that's how we function well. I'm just going to screen share again and show you a, oh, I've lost it. Okay, I'm going to have to go back to here. There is a picture of that, but somehow it's just, oh, here it is. But you won't be able to see the writing on that, I don't think. But when it comes as notes, you will be able to. So that explains what I've just shown you with the hand model. And it's useful for you to have that, but also that video clip, which you can watch to rehearse that. So what happens in the brain in trauma? So what we've seen is what normally happens. And what happens in trauma is that when we sense danger, and our amygdala here in the middle, our early warning system, every 10 to 12 milliseconds, it is scanning the horizon to see if there's danger. So that's physical danger. Am I safe? But it's also social danger. Do I belong? Will people listen? Am I okay with others? So this amygdala here, every 10 to 12 milliseconds is scanning our horizon to see what's happening. And as soon as it senses a threat, whether physical, a threat to our survival or our emotional survival, it releases the stress hormones. And that's a good thing because it G's us up, it revs us up for response. And the brain is flooded with those stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, to get us ready for action. And it causes the fight, flight, freeze, or the flop and drop response. So in response to a threat, we're either going to fight it or run away from it or just play dead or go numb so that we don't feel the worst effects. And that's what this amygdala does through the hypothalamus. It releases those hormones. And we literally flip our libs because the reptilian and the mammalian brains are taking over And if this stayed in contact, it would slow us down in our reaction because we think more slowly than our instinctual brains react. So we literally lose connection with our thinking brains temporarily when we're in that trauma response, because our body just wants us to respond immediately, get us out of danger. And it's an instinctual response, and it is entirely normal. We cannot stop it happening, however much theory we know. And you'll probably have felt this when you suddenly can't think and you're panicking and you think, I can't think of that thing, or I don't know what to do, and you just react. That is entirely normal, and you can't stop it happening. But what you can do, and what we'll think about a bit later on, is how you can bring this thinking brain back online more quickly. Because as you process those hormones of adrenaline and cortisol and deal with the situation, your thinking brain comes back online. And that is self-regulation. So when we experience a traumatizing event, the key aspects of trauma is that it overwhelms our normal capacity to cope. Most of us have resilience that sort of goes up and down like this, like a river in the riverbanks. And we can cope with most situations through the resilience that we've built up during our lives. But through trauma, it's an overwhelm of our normal capacity to cope, and it cuts us off from our resources. We suddenly can't think what to do or what we normally do in this situation because our lids are flipped temporarily. And it breaks connections. We suddenly feel completely on our own. We forget other people are there to help us, or we lose connection with our understandings of how things normally are. And it shatters our assumptions about the way the world should work. How could something like this happen? And it invoking this crisis of meaning. And it renders us powerless. That's a really important one, the powerless bit. So trauma is not in the event itself, but in how it lands in our lives. So not everybody will react to the same event or to COVID-19 as we've been doing in the same way. It will be very different, and that's important that we give ourselves space for that, or others. And it depends on reverberations with previous traumatic experience, depends on the resources we've got around us, if we've got family network in our homes during COVID, or people we can connect with, or we've got good patterns of self-care that we can really bring into play or establish. It also depends on our capacity for self-regulation and our breathing, or whether we do some things like yoga or running or whatever we've already got in place. Those kind of things help us regulate, and those who are around us as our resource, because trauma cuts us off from our resource. So as soon as we can reconnect with that, that's important. And so my question is this situation of the pandemic a trauma? Lots of people are asking that. Well, I think it has the potential to be in its impacts. You know, it's not a one-off shock event, as in a fire, an earthquake, or a flood, or a terrorist attack, like we've seen in past couple of years. But my feeling is, and my experience of this situation that we've been going through in COVID-19, is that it's a huge body shock to the system globally, locally, and personally. You know, I've really been experiencing quite high levels of anxiety. You know, I wake up in the morning feeling, you know, slightly anxious and not sure, you know, what's going to happen today? How's it going to be? What's going to happen next? What's happening to my family? You know, lots of anxiety and people having to be made redundant in, you know, there's lots of things going on and it's exhausting. And so, as Carla will speak about in a moment in our next session, the normal patterns, the grid, the graph that we've got doesn't quite fit, but the same elements are there. Because at the moment we have a prolonged situation of uncertainty and anxiety that is exhausting and overwhelming. And in the reflective practice groups I've been working with clergy in London diocese, this last week, people have said, I am absolutely exhausted and now I have to open my church. I just simply can't do it. And I haven't had a holiday and the church are pressing me to open, and it's not as easy as, and so in a sense, we've managed ourselves perhaps, but now we come to the next stage. So it's the trauma that keeps giving, as I've said. And many losses have occurred already, and there are more to come. And so in the breakout rooms, you've got chance to be able to talk about what your experience of this lockdown period has been, what you recognize or what resonates with you from what I've just gone through in these notes. What have you experienced in yourself? And what is it that's helped you to cope? And what is it that you need? Because one of the things that the trauma research has shown us about resilience is that the actual naming of what's going on for us, that recognition in our bodies of what's happening for us, and giving it a name and naming it rather than just pushing it aside and trying to ignore it, but naming what's going on for us and being able to say, what do I need? Simply to ask yourself, if I'm feeling this, if I'm sensing this, what do I need? And new connections are made in our brains when we can name what's happening for us. So it doesn't make it worse, which is our fear, but it actually helps us in that process of acceptance and integration of what's happening for us. And it makes new connections in the brain, new pathways that aid integration. So I'm going to stop there. And allow you to go into your breakout rooms with the two questions that what have you noticed about yourself in this period of lockdown, and what do you need? So I'll hand back to, is it Jenny? Oh, my brain's gone dead, you see, I'm starting to panic.
That's all right, Hilary, I'll take over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you so much for such an illuminating and sensitive portrayal of the issues that we face internally and how we relate to the outside world. So we're going to move into groups now, and obviously relate and share as far as you wish to, but recognize confidentiality. And also, it may be that your group functions really, really well together and there's lots of chat going on. If it's kind of awkward and nobody's saying anything, it'd be really helpful if somebody was able maybe just to take the lead with the questions so that we can progress things. But basically, there's no feedback from this. That's the good news for you. So you don't have to share beyond this group, but I'm sure it will be very fulfilling to do so within it. So we'll now move into our groups. Thank you very much.